Wait a second. This isn't your grandma's cancer show.
Not your grandma's cancer show.
Hi, I'm Tatum Durock, and this is Not Your Grandma's Cancer Show. And I say that every episode, but this time we're talking about something that grandmas or granddads don't have to face. We're talking about what it's like when cancer takes away your ability to have children or grandchildren, and how challenging that can be to talk about. And it can be quite an isolating experience because out there's quite a bit of awareness of what it is to want to be child-free, and what it is to maybe be infertile but keep trying for a rainbow baby, whether that be through giving birth or adoption or surrogacy, but not a lot of resources for people who that isn't on the cards for them. So I have two brilliant guests with me today. I have Terri Wingham, who was 30 when she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she's in Vancouver. She's joining us over Skype. And I have Clare with me in the studio, and Clare was 17 when she had an osteocarcinoma. Did I say that right?
It's osteosarcoma. Really
I knew I was going to mess that up. And she was 17 when she had that on her chest wall. Terri, hi. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
And can I ask, so what else was going on in your life when you were first diagnosed?
Sure. I was 30 years old, working as a headhunter in the technology industry in Vancouver, really at the height of my career, and single at the time, although not by choice, but really focused on building my career and living my life and hoping to get married and start a family.
So had you always pictured a family? Like, was that something that you'd always carried with you?
I knew I wanted to be a mother from the age of 9.5.
Really?
My parents brought my baby brother home from the hospital when I was 9, and I had two older siblings, but had always wanted a younger sibling. And so I claimed him as my own. He was my baby. And so I was with him as much as I could be. And I did everything really that I could for him, other than obviously, I would watch my mother breastfeed, and I would really equate that with motherhood and think, one day that'll be me.
Yeah. That's such a powerful image of like just really wanting and craving that from such an early age. Because I know a lot of people, when they get a little sibling, that puts them off. It's quite the opposite.
And perhaps the age gap helped.
Yeah. And so for you, was there a certain moment when you knew that you weren't going to be a mother, or was it more of a kind of an evolving process?
It's been an evolving process. And I think for me, that process started even earlier than my diagnosis at the age of 30. My dad's family in Canada was part of a genetic study as one of the first 10 families studied in the country for the BRCA1 gene mutation. And so I learned at the age of 19 that I had the BRCA1 gene mutation, and I started screening for cancer at age 23. And from then on, really the conversation was, when was I going to get a prophylactic double mastectomy so I wouldn't get breast cancer, and that I would have to get my ovaries out at the age of 35. And so I spent my 20s grappling with those decisions and ultimately just wasn't ready to make them. I really equated motherhood with breastfeeding from watching my mom and my younger brother. And so I just resisted making that decision. And I just thought, maybe I'll do the prophylactic surgery after I have kids. But it was, this sort of other shoe that I kept waiting for it to fall throughout my 20s. And even still, throughout my 30s, from an ovarian perspective, made it really tricky.
So you were being screened and were very aware of your cancer risk. And was it at one of those screenings that your cancer was picked up?
It was. So I feel very fortunate that I was part of this genetics surveillance program, essentially. And so I would have an MRI every year, and 6 months later, I would have a mammogram. And so I saw the genetics oncologist twice a year, and it was through an MRI that they picked up something in 2009. And I had initially a biopsy that came back negative, but it was really thanks to a radiologist who just didn't feel confident she had the right tissue sample and ordered an MRI guided biopsy. And that's how my cancer was discovered. So I feel incredibly fortunate that that surveillance program meant that I was diagnosed at stage 1,
Right.
given that it was a triple negative grade 3 tumor. So a very aggressive cancer that, had I not been screened, likely the end result would have been quite different.
And knowing your risk factor before you were diagnosed, do you feel like that changed your experience of being diagnosed?
I thought that it would. Somehow I thought, well, I should have known and I would be mentally prepared for it. But I think it was so wrapped up in this dream I had for my life of motherhood that I was really angry when I was diagnosed, because I knew I was high risk and I thought I might get cancer, but I just assumed it would be once I was married and had a family.
Right.
And that maybe I would have had my kids and I would have had these preventative surgeries. So when it came at the age of 30, I was really blindsided by it, and then sort of angry at myself for being shocked. It's like, why are you shocked? You've lived with this risk for a long time, but it just wasn't on my agenda.
Yeah. And so when you were diagnosed, did it then reframe your ideas around motherhood? Were you thinking that it still might happen, or do you feel at that point that kind of a door started to close?
I still was hopeful. I was 30, and I'd been out for lunch with someone, a consultant of mine that I had placed into a job, and happened to have a conversation with, and this person said, you should look at fertility preservation. And I didn't know anything about that, but I reached out to my oncologist and they referred me into a fertility clinic in Vancouver. And I went into those appointments and started exploring the process. But at the time, they said that the technology was such that embryos had a much higher likelihood of survival than eggs did. And I was so overwhelmed with the diagnosis and, all that was coming at me that I couldn't bring myself to make a decision about a sperm donor. It just really felt really foreign to me. But they did say that the chemotherapy was fertility sparing. And so there was a chance that even after chemotherapy, I might still be able to conceive naturally. And so I think for me, it's been this slow evolving resolution, or I don't know, coming to peace with it. But I don't think you ever really get to a point where you think, oh, it's fine, don't worry,
Right.
I'm cool with it, but I've slowly been able to accept that my path is different than I thought it would be. And I had to give myself permission to really grieve the loss of the life that I wanted in order to be able to accept a new version of my life.
And kind of going into that grief, were there moments that you consciously allowed yourself to grieve, or were there times that you caught yourself grieving and it wasn't until after that you put 2 and 2 together?
I think it was both. And I really feel so much gratitude. I had a wonderful psychologist that I saw through treatment and continue to see her over time. And she really gave me permission to feel my emotions and to help me realize that she used to say to me, Terri, the only way out is through. You have to allow yourself to feel this, so that you can come through the other side of it. But, there would still be moments, and there still are moments where it catches up to you and you feel blindsided in the moment, or you think, oh, I thought I'd processed that. And you realize it's an evolution. There's never a moment where it's all sorted and packaged up neatly.
And was there a moment that surprised you, where you had a reaction that you weren't expecting to something that was more challenging than you had anticipated?
Yeah, I think it was really challenging for me in that period of going through the treatment, and even, going for an ultrasound on my breast. and really being angry, thinking, I really thought I'd be having an ultrasound on my uterus at this age,
Yeah.
and I was at the age where my friends were getting married and having kids, and I really was happy for them and so desperately sad for myself at the same time. And so I found myself in a pretty dark place because it just seemed so cruel, especially maybe people who didn't know that they really wanted kids, and then
Yes.
suddenly they were pregnant. And I just was so sad for myself that I thought, you didn't even know if you wanted it. My sister is shockingly fertile. So she had three children in pretty quick succession. And I know for her, we're really close. And it was hard for me that she was having a family so easily, and she was exhausted from having these three young kids. And so there was those moments where I really valued being the aunt, and I continue to value that. And it was still hard.
Yeah. It's that moment with the ultrasound I can so relate to, because there are these moments that in my mind that is sort of like a timeline that has diverged, and there is these visual things like the ultrasound that link you to the life that you thought you were going to have. I know when I had my ovaries taken out, I was having a really hard time recovering. It was, super challenging. I just wasn't coming out from the anesthesia really well. It was, after chemo and radiation and everything. And so they very kindly put me in a private room. And so I woke up and it was signs on the walls of how to hold your baby. And they'd put me in a room that they would put a mum right after she had given birth with all the signs and the equipment and everything. And it was like waking up to a horror. But also like this could have been my room in my alternate timeline. Do you think about the mother that you would have been? Does your brain ever go there?
I don't know that I let myself go there too much, And I think in some respects, I feel so grateful that I had this connection to my younger brother, because when I was 16, 17 at home for the summers, I took care of him. I made dinner for the family. I did the laundry. Like in some respects, I was a stay-at-home mom for a couple of summers. And so, he will say to this day, he's now almost 31, and he would say, when he had a bad dream, he would come and crawl into bed with me because he wanted me to comfort him. And so I feel fortunate that I had those flashes of what it might be. And I think, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the nuts and bolts of what kind of mother I would be, but I think I bring the same sort of nurturing personality and perspective to the work that I do. And so in many ways, I get to mother people, even if they're not children, which I would imagine I would mother children in a similar way.
And the work that you do have you spoken about this particular topic? Because the reason I ask is that I know that even within the cancer community, there's not necessarily always, it can be challenging. I know you mentioned talking to a therapist about it, but have you talked to other people about not being a parent, that particular element of grief?
I have, but it's only now that I'm becoming, it's interesting because I facilitate programs to help people heal the emotional scars of cancer. And part of our model is that as a facilitator, you're willing to be vulnerable and share pieces of your story, because I think it creates an environment where then other people feel safe to open up and share their story. And so I've shared pieces of it, but I also believe as a facilitator, it's not the participant's job to help me process my own experiences. I only share things that I've processed enough to talk about with them. And so I think it's just now as I've turned 40, and for me, turning 40 was somehow instrumental in me starting to realize that motherhood isn't going to happen. Because I think up until now, I had my fallopian tubes removed as a preventative measure, and I need to make a decision about when to have my ovaries removed, which is still not an easy decision for me. But I think something about that turning of the clock has helped me realize that, it's not in the cards for me in the way that I thought. And it's made me more willing to talk about it because I think it's such an isolating thing. And I want other people to know that it's okay to grieve that. And, the organization I run is called A Fresh Chapter, and it's about helping people move forward sort of with the next phase of their life. But you have to grieve the chapters that you thought you would have in order to step into a new version of your story. And so I really am at a place now where I want to talk about it now that I've come to a greater degree of peace with it. Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense. Yeah, because otherwise it can feel very vulnerable, but not necessarily the safest kind of vulnerable to put it out there when you haven't sort of felt the edges of it yet. And like you said, like, I think sometimes when you're in a position where you're often facilitating and helping other people, that I think sometimes it can be really hard to put things out there as well until you're putting them out, not packaged, but thought through, and so that you're not kind of having them land on other people. But has anyone ever responded, not necessarily like, but out in the world, like when people say to you, "Oh, so do you have children?" How do you answer that question?
It's interesting because I get that question a lot, and especially with the work that I do, because we run volunteer programs in other countries, and in many other cultures, it's completely foreign to not have children. And so I'll get that question a lot. Are you married? Do you have children? Why not? So in some regards, it's made it easier for me because I realize that culturally that in some of these places, that's just a normal means of conversation. And so it's prepared me for when I'm in the US or Canada and I get that conversation or get that question. But I often get the question, why not? And, I think I'm a big fan of Brene Brown and her work on vulnerability. And she talks about, people have to earn the right to hear elements of your story. And so if I'm talking to someone that I don't know well and they ask me that, I brush it off a little bit because I don't think it's their business to know the pain that I have around that topic. But if it's somebody who's been through something in their life or they have their own grief, I think it's a really wonderful opportunity to build a connection and to help someone else feel less alone. So I really gauge my audience in terms of what I share.
Yeah, because those conversations, they can be so intrusive, can't they? And people can say the most random stuff. So it's I think it is quite good, especially like if someone's kind of at the beginning of realizing that children aren't on the cards for them, almost to have like a guide for how to deal with those questions. And I really liked what you said about, the cab driver doesn't necessarily don't have to disclose, but if you think it's someone that, you'd like to open up a bit more to. I have had the oddest things. Like when I've said that I couldn't have children, I had one lady say, "Oh, well, my brother married a woman that couldn't have children. And you know what? He stayed with her."
Man.
Like, really? So it is sometimes, I think, before I think we need people in our lives that we can say things to unfiltered, right? It doesn't have to be processed yet, that they get us raw. And then there are times, because of how you mentioned like cultures and societies see women that don't have children, and it is almost this open discussion that we also can protect ourselves as well.
Yeah, and I think the path is different for all of us. And so giving ourselves permission to feel whatever we're feeling and to choose who we let in and when we do, and that it's okay to say to someone, I'm not going to talk about it. Because people say like the worst things sometimes, or that there's lots of ways to have a family. Oh, thank you so much. So I wouldn't have thought of that on my own.
Because it doesn't it always come with the phrase, so have you ever thought about adoption?
Right.
Yeah.
It does. Yeah. Yeah, and I think when people do that, it minimizes, and one of the things we talk a lot about is this idea of holding space for people, this ability to be present with someone's grief, be present with their story without trying to fix or editorialize it or give suggestions. And I think so often when it comes to this discussion about motherhood, people aren't comfortable with other people's grief and pain. And so they say something so that they don't have to feel it alongside you, which is the opposite of what most of us need as humans. We need to be heard.
Yes.
But then people can't give you what they don't have. And so, when you see that coming, for me, I just put my wall up and say, oh yeah, here's somebody who's going to give me useless information. And it's not their fault. It's just where they're at in their life.
Yeah. I mean, I aspire to have that viewpoint. I know that sometimes, and Claire, let me know what you think with this, is that sometimes I feel like that question is so loaded with judgment that it's kind of like, well, don't complain, because if you're not adopting, then you're not really trying to fix the problem. And therefore it's kind of like, okay, the end of the story. And there's a little part of me that is like, are they right? Are they, did I do everything? And I know in a logical sense I did everything, but I don't always get to separate it out onto them. I know that sometimes that question sends me into a little bit of turmoil.
Yeah, I think it's when someone says something that perhaps you've thought about yourself that you haven't quite processed or you haven't quite come to terms with. Like, have I done everything I could have? Is there more I could have done? Should I have lived my life differently so that my situation was different, so it might have been easier? If those are questions you have asked yourself at any point, hearing them said by someone else, I find can really... I mean, I know they mean well, and it's not kind of meant as a dig, but it just makes you re-question, I think.
It can, can't it?
It can do, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah.
And it's triggering, right? Those kind of questions can be really triggering for us. So I absolutely relate. And I think for me, it's whenever I have the conversation about ovary removal, because it's also preventative and everybody's got an opinion about when I should do it. And, being lectured by people about my life and my decisions, I find, makes me really angry and really triggered. And so I can so relate.
And when that happens, do you extricate yourself from the conversation, or do you let them know?
I guess the answer to that, it depends on who it is, and so if it's somebody who is going to be in my life, I had this fight with one of my cousins about this a few years ago. And so somebody like that, I'm going to educate them and I'm going to stand my ground. But somebody who I might meet at a conference or I might meet in passing, for me, it's not worth the energy to try to change their mind or convey my point of view. It's just going to make me angry and exhausted. And so in that regard, I usually shut it down.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I find it really difficult because I'm not a confrontational I don't find it easy to challenge anyone, like at the best of times, let alone at a time when it's about something that I feel a bit shaky about myself. So I've got that internal voice going, don't have this conversation because you'll end up in messy tears and no one wants to see that. And you really start kind of talking yourself out of having the conversation because it feels easier. In the long run, it's not easier because you're never having the conversations and you're never, or I am never sort of opening up. So it doesn't help. But short-term thinking goes, let's just, finish this conversation as soon as possible, not let them know I'm upset, very British, and just get on with it and pretend I'm fine. It's something I'm really aware that I'd like to. It's almost like practicing it, isn't it, with people who you really do trust.
Yeah.
Certainly not the Uber driver who asks you whether you want kids or not.
Unless you want to really practice on someone that you're probably never going to see again.
It might affect my rating though, so you know.
I have taken the thing of when someone has asked me a question, I'm like, okay, I'm going to give you the answer. And maybe you might not like it, but I sometimes have wondered whether there's a little bit of defensiveness in there that happens. But, you know, when people start talking about adoption, I'm like, have you ever thought about it? Tell me how
I
you...
like that.
Yeah, like I get a little bit, you know, and, you know, and do you think that the adoption agency is going to give me a child? You know, and that makes them stop in the tracks because it's like they just think that you just walk in somewhere and walk out with a kid. And
that's something that really irritates me, because there is a sense of, well, yeah, if you really wanted a kid, you'd go down this route. And I'd be like, as a single person with an ongoing health problem that is progressive, without my own house, like that's just never going to happen at the moment.
Right.
Like I'm, you know, but the reality is it's not an option for many people.
Yeah.
And the assumption, it's just like all the other assumptions about having children that the world has. It's another one that people get really wrong. And maybe it would be nice to educate people a little.
Because I think, they don't necessarily know what they're saying when they say that. It's just like, oh, well, you're a person that wants a child. There's a child that wants a parent. Surely you guys can just get together and figure it out. But actually, you know, you hear about people that, you know, were maybe not ready to adopt, or maybe that wasn't, you know, and they end up with a child, but they haven't actually grieved. And this poor child is having to deal with now being taken in by a family that maybe weren't ready, or a person that weren't ready to adopt, but they're a filler for the child that they've never grieved, that they didn't have, which I think is just like such a loaded process. Like if you're ready to adopt, that's a very different process than, you know, but it's kind of, people want to like put them in, okay, solved it now.
Yeah.
It's all good now.
I think it's like having children naturally, isn't it? If you get to 38 and you think, I'm 30, I should have a kid, because otherwise, if your life is not ready for a kid, then it's maybe not a good idea. It's just like it's just the same process you're going through. You've got to be really ready and set up in the right position.
Yeah, I totally agree that you do have to, you know, I think that's the thing, is it's such a huge thing. You do have to be ready. And Terri, you have an organisation that helps people kind of making that transition, that post-cancer transition to life going forwards. And you mentioned it, it's called A Fresh Chapter. Can you tell us what you do?
Sure. And I'd love to share sort of the origin of where it came from, because it relates to this dream of motherhood that I had. But, you know, I was coming through treatment and I feel like I was really well supported while I was going through treatment. You know, people would bring over meals and take me to the doctor, and I felt like they would show up physically. But I felt like the emotional aftermath of cancer caught up with me as the physical side was starting to subside. And I just was wildly unprepared for it. Had no idea that I would grapple with depression and survivor guilt and isolation and a lot of grief around motherhood. And I think for me, you know, if we're talking about these choices about adoption, or these choices that are not simple, I think there's also this challenge when what the vision I had for my life wasn't just being a mother, it was being part of a family. And I really wanted a partner and to have kids together and to sort of be this unit. That was always a piece of the dream, in addition to just the part about motherhood. But I remember, you know, sitting in my apartment in Vancouver and just being really angry and devastated that my life had not turned out the way that I'd wanted it to. And I think probably I'd just gone through so many tears, and, you know, Susan, my therapist, was probably right. Like I finally came out the other side in that moment. I think I could come back into periods of grief about it. But in that moment, I had this realization of, you know, I'm looking at my life about what's not possible. I'm not married, I don't have kids, but what if I could turn it on its head and start to think about what is possible for me right now because my life hasn't turned out the way that I thought it would. And it was this idea of writing a new chapter in my story and thinking about, okay, I can't change the chapters that have happened. The future plot that I had envisioned is gone. But what could I do? And it was that idea of looking for inspiration and doing something that I never would have been able to do had I been married with kids that led me to a volunteer trip in South Africa. And so in 2011, I spent 6 weeks volunteering at an underfunded daycare in one of the townships outside of Cape Town. And then I took some money out of my retirement savings and I traveled through Namibia, Botswana, and Zambia, and I saw Victoria Falls, which had been a dream of mine. But it was that volunteering with these 2 and 3-year-olds in Langa, the township, that shifted something in me. And I fell head over heels in love with a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old in that daycare. And I felt, for the first time since I had cancer, I felt useful. I felt empowered. I felt like I had something to give, like I had the ability to nurture somebody else. And it was this experience that not only helped me heal, but it also gave me such deep perspective, where I went into the experience really angry and disenchanted with my life. And I met people who I realized would trade places with me in an instant to have access to the opportunities I had simply because of where I was born. And I really saw the universality of struggle. I saw mothers who struggled to feed and clothe their kids. I saw families who'd been torn apart by HIV. I saw people who lived under incredible oppression during the apartheid era and still did, deal with the aftermath of that. And I really thought, wow, yes, I'm allowed to be angry and sad and feel victimized by cancer, but what if I could do something with this possibility that I have because of where I was born, because I got access to free healthcare in Canada, and I had a job that gave me, disability pay. And so I was in a position that I could do something new with my life. And that's what led to the creation of A Fresh Chapter as a nonprofit. It started as a blog where I was writing about my life post-cancer, but really this idea of how to help other people shift perspective through volunteering and through creating this safe environment to talk about the grief and to make space for both the highs and the lows in our lives. And so, that was 2011 when I went to South Africa. And in 2013, we piloted our first program in India, where we brought together 12 cancer patients and survivors for a 2-week immersive volunteer and psychosocial support experience and a cultural immersion. And since then, we've just continued to grow to different countries, different types of programs. But at its core, it's about helping give people the space and permission to both grieve what they've lost and discover new perspectives and possibilities in their lives.
Wow. I mean,
That sounds incredible.
Right. Yeah. Talk about holding space. What you're offering is space on both ends of the spectrums, not trying to squish one side and just have the momentum forward, but really to hold, to experience it all, grief and possibility at the same time. That sounds incredible. And it must be really rewarding for you.
It's so rewarding because I think, when I don't know if you've read Simon Sinek's books about Start With Why and Find Your Why, but I realized over this last 10 years that really my why in life is to create a sense of belonging for people. And I think, I always thought I would do that inside a nuclear family and create that sense of belonging with kids and with a husband. But I found that, there's so many people who are looking for belonging, or maybe haven't had the chance to be part of a family that brings them joy, and really started to think about what if I could create a sense of family for people. And, to have participants, we now have over 225 alumni. And one of our participants who traveled with us to South Africa last year was from Kenya. And she'd heard me speak at a support group in Nairobi where I talked about my grief over motherhood, because I felt like in that audience, that was something contextually that the people I was talking to would understand, regardless of, their socioeconomic background or where they came from. Maybe they couldn't relate to, the opportunity I had to give up everything and travel the world, but they could relate to grief over motherhood. And she ended up coming with us as a fellow on one of our programs. And she remembered my talk and she said, Terri, in many ways, you're like a mother to me, even though I'm older than you. She was a breast cancer survivor in Kenya. And she said, because you've opened up the world to me. You've made it possible for me to come to this new country and to learn and to grow and to experience new things. And you've challenged me to step outside my comfort zone, and you've created a place for me to belong. And that just brought me to such tears because I really had never thought about it that way. And it made me realize that, yes, I still grieve that I don't have that nuclear family that I always wanted. And I don't think that pain ever fully goes away. But I know that if I was married and I did have kids and they were, going to soccer practice and, doing the homework, I wouldn't have this life. I couldn't travel the way I do. I couldn't build an organization that, our vision is to scale to reach millions of lives and really help people beyond cancer, anybody who's been through grief, to be able to heal through volunteering and through finding that space for dark and light. And so I try to look at it from that context of, maybe motherhood for me isn't what I pictured, but it doesn't make it any less valuable and important.
Yeah. Wow, that's incredible. And if someone's looking to find out more about your organization, where would they find you?
Sure. We're at afreshchapter.com.
Super. And are you on Instagram?
We are. So we're on Instagram at A Fresh Chapter, as well as my name, Terri Wingham, with an I. And, we're going to be launching applications for our international programs again in January, but we're also expanding. We're launching our first program in Kenya this September, where we're bringing together Kenyans affected by cancer and Americans affected by cancer, and really working collaboratively on developing a toolkit where we take the resources and tools that we've developed over the last 5 years, and we translate them for the Kenyan culture and really think about how do we work with Kenyan survivors to roll that out across the country. But we're also expanding an online version of our programming so that we can reach more people who wouldn't be able to travel. And so we'll have updates coming soon about ways to get engaged virtually in our program.
Wonderful. I will definitely keep a lookout for those. Thank you so much, Terri, for joining us today. Really appreciated chatting to you. And you've really created incredible experiences for other people and given yourself so much space as well. It's really wonderful to hear.
Well, it's been such a pleasure to connect with you both, and I look forward to one day hopefully hearing more about your stories, because I can tell just from our limited interaction that they're powerful and inspiring stories. So thank you both for speaking with me today.
Yeah, and Claire's going to stay with me, and we're going to hear more about Claire's story shortly. So, Claire, how was the experience of hearing Terri's story?
Yeah, it's always amazing to hear stories from other people who've gone through similar experiences, but equally sort of noting the differences as well. And it's amazing how the practical differences don't seem to really matter when you're talking about the underlying feelings and the kind of internal responses you have. So really interesting. And it's something that I don't really talk about that much. So again, really kind of therapeutic in a way.
Yeah. So talking about it.
Yeah.
Have you spoken to people about how you felt about not being a mom?
Not a lot. I've had counselling, therapy. I think it was really helpful because I actually trained in counselling for a bit, and they kind of not forced, that's the wrong word, encouraged to be in therapy yourself, and it's something that was really helpful because I don't know that I would have sought it out as an issue to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously going through kind of the impact of everything that's happened, it was the first time probably, I'd ever said, this is really difficult. This is a big thing. I think for me, partly because I was young when I was diagnosed.
17.
Yeah. So it's quite a different experience to be told at 17 that your fertility might be affected. I think primarily just trying to put myself back there because you're not thinking about having babies. But most people. I wasn't thinking about having babies at 17. And actually I remember as a teenager growing up going, I don't want kids. Oh, what a pain. Like, because I'd had younger siblings who were quite a lot younger, and I'd like, they're fine. I love them, but,
So quite different from Terri and her brother.
like, I don't think it was a serious life vision, but I was definitely not... I wanted to be a city lawyer, and I thought, well, kids don't fit in with that. I want to be wearing power suits and in business meetings. It wasn't about, like, a family life. But that's because I was 16, 17. It was... I think your visions are driven by ambition, and mine was academics, and it wasn't about settling down. So at that point, I didn't actually have time to go through any fertility preservation. I needed chemo sort of to start immediately because I was quite unwell by the time I was diagnosed. So that decision was taken out of my hands, and it was a bit of a, well, let's wait and see what happens after treatment. This can be really detrimental to your fertility. It can wipe it out completely, effectively, the treatment I had. So it was a sort of get on with it and see what happens afterwards. And so it was something I knew was a possibility that it would be affected. But then it was sort of gradually through my 20s, as I had further tests, that I discovered that it had been affected, and then the extent to which it had been affected. And then also the extent to which other things had been affected that would then impact the potential for adoption or, other kind of fertility treatment.
So as a result of your treatment, you developed a lung...
Yeah. So I've got my tumour was in my chest wall. So I had a lot of radiation, like sort of a couple of months of radiation and a few surgeries on my chest. And I developed this condition called bronchiectasis, which can be kind of... People can have it quite mildly, but I've got it over all of my lungs. So it kind of, the best way to describe people who, because it's something people haven't heard of, it kind of mirrors cystic fibrosis in the lungs. It doesn't have the other systemic problems that CF has, but it's progressive and it's incurable. And at some point I'll probably need a lung transplant from it. So it's it's not great, but I've known about it I've lived with it for 20 years, and I manage it on a daily basis. But it is something that does impact things like having other surgeries is kind of more dangerous for me because my lung capacity, getting infections is really dodgy. So going through a pregnancy, whether it was my exit, it's kind of not on the cards at all. So I guess, it was one of those realizations in terms of fertility, something that came slowly. And then over time, I've sort of looked at the various other options like adopt and realised it's got a slow dawning that that's probably not going to work either. So it's been an interesting journey.
Yeah, I when I was doing some research for this episode, and actually the last one about guilt, I discovered that so I had my ovaries taken out, but then I had this opportunity to have IVF and put an embryo inside me, and I had one shot because it was really dangerous because my cancer was a hormone cancer, and they had pumped me full of the most amount of hormones possible, and it still wasn't enough, and like the lining hadn't gotten thick enough, and so I went from being pregnant, losing the pregnancy, to being back in menopause, which is a hormonal slide that does not exist in nature.
Oh my goodness.
And I processed that. It was interesting, as almost like a grief that hung in, like, you know that Japanese picture of the wave
Yeah.
about to crest, but it hasn't yet, just being suspended. That there was just this long period of time where I felt like this huge wave was going to come down, but there was this numbness, this stillness underneath. And right at that time, I started saying things. So the difference between guilt and shame is guilt, whether real or imagined, is around like an activity. Well, maybe if I had taken more magnesium or, should I have upped my folate or something, that would be sort of guilt. And so guilt is, I made a mistake, and shame is, I am a mistake. And I realized that in that time was when I started calling myself medium shit.
Yeah.
And walking around the world going, I don't have the worst luck. I just have medium shit luck.
Medium shit.
Medium shit. And perhaps a child shouldn't come into medium shit. So I am the problem. And it literally, like, I think sometimes griefs when they're extended. So when you lose someone,
Yeah.
there can be numbness and grief can go on for a long time, but you kind of know roughly the rhythm of it. But when you're dealing with an intangible grief,
Yeah.
of something that you can't quite put, it's invisible, we often then don't necessarily recognize that we are grieving or that we have a shame around it.
No. And there are so many things that I think, like that kind of really negative internal monologue that says, oh, I'm rubbish and this is all about me and I'm a failure. That's a big one, like being a failure as a woman, because what else are women for? That's a terrible statement. But you know what I mean? Like, it's part of being a woman is having babies, and it feels like you're defective in some way. I get that word comes up for me, like a slightly defective woman. And they're all really... can you imagine if I'd said that to you about your situation? You just wouldn't. It's just so unpleasant, really mean chat that we have with ourselves.
Yeah, and I would never think of you as defective.
Do you know what I mean?
In any way, but
it's awful. But I do think there's an element of sort of taking ownership of the problem that means that it feels less out of your control, which kind of, in some weird, perverse way, sort of limits the it's not shock, but the fact it's been done to you is a thing that is kind of awful and scary. You know, that this treatment was given you, and you had no control over it. You had no choice. I mean, I suppose at 17 I could have chosen not to have treatment at all. I would have kept my fertility, but I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be here anymore. So it's not a choice, is it? So I think sometimes that it's all about me and I'm not good enough to do this and my body has failed, and it kind of is taking back, in a weird way, the sort of control over it. Because if it's about me, then I know what and I know why. The bigger picture of why me, I mean, that's always, I mean, that comes up for people all the time, doesn't it, when they get ill? But
it does. And I think that's where it also complicates things, because so when people are dealing with involuntary childlessness because of a variety of different things that are not medical, because actually most involuntary childlessness is not medical. I think only 9% is.
Oh, wow.
So it's quite low. A lot of it is people haven't been with a partner at the time that worked out. When you're just dealing with that, it's a big thing that, again, you can kind of, you know what it is that you're dealing with. But I think when it's in with cancer, it gets really muddy.
yeah,
So when are you grieving the loss of being a parent, and when are you grieving the loss of that your life is now dominated by scanxiety,
yeah,
or being reminded of your mortality and lots of the other ramifications of side effects and doctor's appointments and things bringing you back to that place, that I think it becomes, really muddy to know.
Definitely. Like the number of losses that you have when you go through treatment is huge, and you can just stack them up, like the loss of potentially career, the loss of independence, the loss of sort of the natural relationships you have with people that have shifted into this weird carer patient role, or there's so many losses that you have. I've often found that I've thought about the fertility aspect and thought, how do I specifically grieve for that?
Yes.
Like, as opposed to the shit ton of other stuff that I'm also trying to like get my head around. And I almost want a kind of guidebook for, in order to grieve not having a child, step one,
Yes.
do this, say this to someone and it will make you feel better, because there isn't a handbook
No.
and it would be really nice if there were, because you really feel like you're kind of feeling your way through.
And it comes out in really weird ways.
Really odd.
Like, I remember, it was like there was an animal on television. It was something like a ferret that was giving birth. And I suddenly got so jealous and angry. I was like, this small creature, this small furry creature gets to have children, just gets to have them, just naturally in nature.
Didn't even know what it was doing.
No, just had
prego.
Yeah.
What?
Like,
I know.
oh God. And then certain celebrities as well. Like, I don't know why, but I would just get really angry. And I wouldn't know it was in there brewing until it came out in this like really bizarre way.
Yeah. I get it.
Had that.
When I see people not being nice to their kids on the tube or on the, like, just, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And I appreciate, like, I've looked after a lot of kids. I know it's not all fun and games, and I know I've flipped it. It's not that I'm being unrealistic and have idealised being a parent.
But there are some really bad people.
I mean,
out there.
Some people are like, yeah. But it's not irrational, but it's not necessarily always logical, the reactions you have. That's it. And I find myself doing that weird thing where I sit and just look at a family and just smile like some weirdo. You're just like, oh, doesn't that look lovely? Like, it's odd person on transport watching other families. But yeah, it does come out. It comes out when you don't expect.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of my kind of reticence to talk about it openly, because I don't know how I'm going to react to what I say. And I feel like someone could say something that would, and the fear of like not being in control of your reaction is a big thing.
Yeah, I think it something that Terri was saying about like knowing who you're talking to is a really big thing. I mean, I remember someone that I worked for, and she knew that I had lost the pregnancy and knew that that was my one shot. And she said, you should really get a dog.
Yeah.
So you have something to love. Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. And you're like,
I'd really like to be compassionate about these people and be, well, they don't know what they're saying. But there are some things where you're like, I mean, really?
That you have to kind of steel yourself,
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's kind of being really...
Yeah. I've actually come up to talking about like how you respond to people when they ask the questions. And I found myself often when people say, have you got kids? And I'm like, no. And they're like, would you like kids? I'm like, yeah, because I would like kids. Like, that's not a lie. Or, I find it's quite a nice, that would be lovely. I'm still stating the truth. It's just, it doesn't involve explaining to you my whole medical history.
Oh, I like that. I like that answer. I'm always really surprised when people are still, people have sort of said, still got time. And I'm like, do you know?
I am? Yeah.
Like, there's a little part of me that's like, when I'm 50, I won't have to deal with this anymore. People aren't going to still be like, oh, well, you still could.
Yeah.
It's like, no, actually, no.
But it is amazing. I mean, I do wonder how often the boys get asked this question. Like, it is an amazing preoccupation with women of a certain age, whether they've got fertility issues or not. My single friends I'm 38, and it's kind of anyone in their mid to late 30s is asked regularly by all sorts of people.
Yeah.
It's just like you've got some ownership over everyone's life choices or not choices.
It's, there's three of us obviously talking today, all women, but in reading around the subject, they don't even keep numbers on how many men have children, but they do on how many women do and at what ages. There's a real lack of research into how men feel about not having children. But in some sort of limited studies, there's even been some studies that men feel it more acutely in terms of depression.
Right.
So I think the numbers were like 38% to women's 27%. But again, these are very small scale studies, so there's just a real lack of knowledge and understanding on both ends. You know, that intrusiveness, I think, into women, and then this actual sort of lack of support for men in that position.
And neither are helpful.
Right.
So we're really nailing it on the support in this country.
But I think that's why it's so important to find someone that you can have those conversations with.
Definitely.
Because it can really save you. One of the things that I was reading was about how to know that you're having feelings about not being a parent. And I'm just going to turn a page real quick and make a bunch of noise. So it was about experiencing walking depression, loneliness, hopelessness, low self-esteem, shame, feelings of failure, bitterness.
Oh, sounds like we pretty much nailed those this afternoon, haven't we?
I think
What's walking depression as opposed to...
Oh, numb.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Which I suppose when you have kind of that evolving grief, there is an element of just being numb for a period of time.
I was going to say, I really, really identify with your description of that sort of building, something's going to break here, that kind of wave that's just, I think that feels, I have never identified it as that, and that feels so familiar that must be, or may well be, something a lot of people feel. That I think because there is no break, there's no, like you said, there's no immediate loss. There's no, I had this and then I lost this. It was like, I've never had it. It was an idea of what it might have been.
Yep.
How do you grieve something that you weren't guaranteed in the first place? It's like sort of aspiring to have an amazing job and never quite making it. It was never there. You never knew what it looked like. And so how do you...
But it's also a continual thing because it doesn't end. So I was at a client's house who is a grandma, and she has all the pictures of her grandchildren on the mantelpiece. And it's like, okay, so once you get over grieving being a mum, if you do, or maybe you don't, maybe you accept it and integrate it and live with, you know, both the grief and the possibility, then there is the...
Yeah, it's ongoing,
It's ongoing, you know.
And it goes like just when you know, if I'm at a family event and I go and spend time with my parents, it's that relationship. It's the relationship of a grown-up parent and their grown-up kid, like all the teasing but caring and, you know, all that stuff that you think, it's not just about not having a baby.
Right.
It's about not having a child for life, and that's big.
It doesn't really get much bigger.
No.
It might not get much bigger than that. So, like, in the process, like, we really have to be super kind to ourselves and catch ourselves when we are internalizing that shame.
Yeah.
And figuring out places to kind of, go through the grief and figure out some possibility. So, big stuff. Big stuff. So, you know, put that on your to-do list. But also know that you can check out Shine Cancer Support's webpage and Facebook, and you'll find other people on there in similar positions. And that's always a good place to go. And Terri Wingham's A Fresh Chapter, if you want to check out more of what she's doing. Claire, thank you so much for being here today.
Pleasure.
And thank you, Terri. And we'll see you soon for more of Not Your Grandma's Cancer Show. Till next time. Bye.